get started with our drug policy and psychedelics panel, what's next on the horizon. Just to give you a little bit of background, marijuana legalization has been sweeping the nation over the past couple years. In 2019, we've had a few ballot initiatives around psychedelics created on a municipal and state level. So this panel is really going to focus on what's next for policy and psychedelics. I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves. I have Scott Cecil, Queen Adesuyi, and Jack Davies. So whoever wants to start.
All right. Hi, my name is Jack Davies. I'm a communications strategist and political operative, and I've worked in drug policy reform for the past 15 years or so. I was very lucky and privileged in a lot of ways in that when I was in college, I was hired by MAPS to start working with them when it was just like 2 or 3 people who were very young, working with Rick Doblin back then. And but ultimately, after engaging with that work for a few years, it was very clear, this is, a dozen years ago now, that while they had a sort of broader mission around ending the drug war and making drugs more broadly accessible, all the primary strategy was really just medicalization, and that wouldn't be accessible to most people, particularly the people who are most traumatized in this country, in communities of color. So I ended up moving on to working in drug policy reform more broadly with the ACLU, and then for 10 years with the Drug Policy Alliance. And it kind of frustrated me over the years being as a sort of point person on psychedelics there, in addition to managing communications work, that there was so little emphasis on criminalization and the harms of criminalization in psychedelic spaces, and it was just so much sort of unexamined privilege. So it's really, really exciting to see this gathering today. And thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to learn from everyone here over the next couple days.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Queen Adesuyi, and I'm a policy coordinator with the Drug Policy Alliance, their National Affairs Office here in DC. So DPA is a national advocacy organization working to end the war on drugs and repair the war on drugs broadly. My portfolio primarily is through congressional work and primarily marijuana through a racial justice lens. But I also do marijuana and overdose prevention work locally here in DC through DC Council and the executive and folks here. But also, furthermore, at DPA, we're trying to prioritize decriminalizing all drugs, which essentially means removing criminal penalties for drug use and drug possession. And I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all about how psychedelics falls into that effort and what really would make sense for people most impacted by criminalization post-marijuana legalization, leaving the question of if we should legalize marijuana to now how we should do it and what the next substance is, / what's the next real effort and push towards really ending the war on drugs more broadly outside of individual substances.
Hello, I am Scott Cecil. I'm 37 years old. I live here in the DC area in Mount Rainier, Maryland, where I'm on the city council. So I like to break molds, and so I like to think that I'm the most anti-drug war elected official in the United States, and hopefully not, but I think I might be the only queer, polyamorous, open drug user that is an elected official in the United States, who also wants to legalize sex work and gambling. I am the host of Prohibited, a podcast about prohibition, so that is a plug. Please take out your space phone and go find the podcast and listen to it. I first got involved in drug policy reform after experiencing a marijuana arrest about 10 years ago, where for having about $10 worth of marijuana in my backpack, I found myself facing felony charges because I was living in Arizona at the time, which, by the way, it's still a felony to have any amount of marijuana in that state unless you have a medical card. So after finding myself put on probation and having my bodily autonomy violated repeatedly and things of that nature, having to drop out of school to get a second job to pay for court fines, during a psychedelic experience, while I was going through all this turmoil, a friend gave me some mushrooms. And I had tried psychedelics before, but I remember a distinct moment where I thought, man, they really fucked with the wrong person. And so I really diverted myself from what I wanted to do, which was fix our agricultural system. I had studied sustainability and ecological literacy in school, and instead I went on this journey, which is now about 10 years of trying to end drug prohibition. Those of you who have been at Students for Sensible Drug Policy conferences before, you've seen me and Queen and Ifetayo speak on panels together. So, but this is gonna be the best one so far. I'm really so happy and humbled to be in this space. And I'll just say really briefly to close out that I didn't prepare as much for this panel as I normally would for panels of this nature. We did all have an organizing call, and so we're prepared. But the point I'm trying to make is I started really thinking about the ways in which academia and the ways in which so many spaces like this, like not like this, but how conference spaces that are rooted in academia on some level are also therefore rooted in white dominant culture. And so it's like, I'm gonna prepare the way I feel comfortable preparing, and I think I'm gonna be a better panelist because of that. So thanks for being here. I'm scared to go first.
I guess I'll give a short answer to the first part of the question, maybe a longer answer to the second part. But I mean, it's a legacy of colonialism in a lot of ways, and also the racist caste system in this country. And I think in order to build a new system that repairs the harms of prohibition, we have to really assess what have the harms of psychedelic prohibition been. And you can look at like the number of arrests and something like that, and okay, there's a small number of psychedelics arrests compared to other drugs. It's still a pretty significant number, but then you think of just like the psychological damage of it, the phenomenological experience. I'm as a white person, I can't know what this is like, but I've, you know, the experience phenomenologically of using a drug when you know you're not safe, when you know that you could be stopped by the police, when you know that you're doing something that's criminalized, it changes the experience. So there's like, in addition to just the harms of the arrest and the criminal justice system, there's, you know, criminalization affects the experience of something that's so open to your environment and to suggestion.
So I think the harms are twofold. One being the harms of not being able to access medicine, especially if you're a person who's dealt with extreme levels of trauma, if you've lived through poverty, living in a marginalized identity, living in a marginalized body. All of these decades of not being able to access medicine that actually would be better for you than what is being pushed out through pharmaceuticals is a huge harm. But on the other end, through criminalization, really, we can't really understate the harms of what an arrest and incarceration can do to a person. The collateral consequences of arrest and incarceration are really dire for the most vulnerable people. Because really, if you come from a wealthy background, if you come from a privileged background, most of the harms of arrest and incarceration can be relieved, basically. If you're in a situation where you're cash poor, if you're housing unstable, if you have a lot of financial responsibilities, family responsibilities, if you're discriminated against because of your race, the person you love, things like that, the thousands of collateral consequences from arrests really can destabilize your life even further. So really trying to account for how many people have been impacted by psychedelic arrests. And I think that needs to lead the conversation when we're talking about legalizing psychedelics, censoring people who have been actually impacted by prohibition of psychedelics. On the front end, where they weren't able to access the medicine, and quality of life has had to suffer because of that, and then also acknowledging that people have been harmed from the policies itself.
When thinking about this question over the last couple of days, I started thinking about, so there's this trend, and I know we'll get to this later, about decriminalizing plant-based drugs as opposed to the other kind, which I don't even really know what that means, but I started thinking about what is a plant-based drug? And within the context of the United States, I thought about tobacco, which tobacco as a cash crop predates the founding of the United States in these lands. And, well, why is that? And I thought, well, because it was really easy to commercialize and sell tobacco on like a mass scale. And so my theory here would be anything that didn't fit into capitalism that would allow it to be mass produced by exploiting the labor of others and then producing it, or distributing it in a way that is also inequitable, and then either punishing or not punishing folks for using it in a way that is not equitable, is really, for me, the genesis or the basis of what is or is not prohibited. And so I think this trend is very clear when you look at what is being decriminalized or legalized. It's really easy to commercialize cannabis, right? So that's why it's being allowed to be able to be commercialized or legalized. And so I try to think of this as, I'm not interested in legalizing drugs, I'm interested in ending drug prohibition. And I think those are two different things. Like, we need to just get rid of the drug prohibition part, because I think legalizing drugs is just trying to build on top of a foundation of something that's not working or is working perfectly, depending on how you're looking at it and what you think the purposes of it are.
Just to add to that, I mean, the difference between decrim and legalization, it's a difference without definition, really, but it really does make a difference on the local level, whether or not a drug is allowed for sale or not. I mean, marijuana was decriminalized in New York since the 70s, and millions of people have still been arrested and impacted by marijuana arrests. So it's a really complicated situation when it comes to, regulation. But the thing is that regulation doesn't have to look like big corporate dispensaries. And that's what we've been seeing with marijuana for the most part, because we haven't been dreaming bigger than just corporations. And we're really in a place where we're trying to operate and find liberation through capitalism, which is really complicated. But the idea is that hopefully we'll eventually think of ideas that are beyond just that kind of corporate structure, beyond just marijuana. But I think when we think about the policy, decriminalization isn't enough, but it's definitely a starting point for reducing the chances of people being harmed by criminalization. And also, like, how do you gain access to medicine when there's no legal way to get it without still being subject to harms by criminalization?
Thank you, Queen. That takes me to my next question. We're talking about the corporatization of marijuana, and Michelle Alexander said white men are poised to make lots of money from what black men have been doing and are in prison for, right? So what lessons can we learn from marijuana legalization and drug decriminalization globally? I know there's countries like Portugal, Czech Republic, who have decriminalized all drugs. So what lessons can we take from marijuana legalization, the good and the bad, drug decriminalization, and how can we apply that to psychedelics or include psychedelics in drug decrim?
So I think the biggest lesson is to not exceptionalize one drug at a time and pit drugs against each other, which has been the case with marijuana, and it's helped marijuana, like the momentum behind it, comparing marijuana to other substances that are considered more hard drugs. And I'm quoting, hard drugs intentionally. pitting against each other people who smoke marijuana versus people who inject heroin. And that's really not the best way to get to liberation when we're talking about removing the harms for people who use drugs generally. Like, we don't want to find liberation when it comes to psychedelics at the cost of our brothers and sisters who use other drugs. So at least for me, one of the biggest lessons from efforts around marijuana legalization is to think outside of just the particular substance that you may find healing from, because people find healing from a lot of different substances, and we're all being harmed by the criminalization of all of the substances. And I mean, when we think about Portugal, drug decriminalization is an evidence-based policy. Like, it's not, some not applicable thing to the US. When we think about the overdose crisis, this one and the ones that have been happening over decades, like from the 60s, with heroin in African American communities, the crack epidemic. When we think about overdose and making sure that people can use drugs in a way that's healthy, that minimizes the harm associated with the drugs that they're using, it has to be a comprehensive approach. When we medicalize psychedelics and, when talking points are just that psychedelics, it's not heroin, it's not meth. Emphasizing just the medical side of it really limits the scope of how we're able to really liberalize everyone. And then it complicates just efforts to destigmatize drugs in general when we pit drugs against each other and pit people against each other.
What lessons can be learned from marijuana legalization? I'll start with that one. Well, I think I'll give a specific example of marijuana legalization, and I keep using quotes because if it's not legal for people under 21, how is that legal, for example? So arrests of black youth went up in Colorado after marijuana legalization in 2012. So I'm just gonna say that again. Arrests of black youth went up in Colorado after marijuana legalization in 2012. Well, why is that? It's because we haven't fixed the problem that our society is obsessed with punishing black people, and specifically punishing young black men and criminalizing their behavior that their white counterparts or their older counterparts don't have to experience. So if we're going to try to legalize substances, and Queen nailed it, obviously, like what we shouldn't do and what we probably can't do is go molecule by molecule and do a ballot initiative in the states that allow that and think that somehow that's gonna lead us to ending the drug war. I just personally don't think that's gonna work. So I think we should stop doing that. And I don't know, I think there are people from all over the country here in the room. Pay attention to what your state legislature specifically is doing, because in a lot of states, what they'll do every year, like every legislative session, there'll be somebody who will introduce a bill and be like, these are all the substances that we're prohibiting. And it'll just be dozens of research chemicals, dozens of different molecules that the legislators have never even heard of. Who thinks that that's gonna work? But also, maybe the ramification of that will be somebody who's producing whatever substance, XYZ, will just come in and slightly change the molecule, and then, okay, now it's not illegal anymore, but maybe it is more dangerous. Lessons, good and bad, and I mean, there are good things about the marijuana industry, but I just don't feel like they're worth highlighting. Good and bad things about, because neat, like, I've known people that were selling marijuana for a long time. Did they get to be integrated into the illicit marketplace? I'm not seeing that happening. Actually, I'll complain about one other thing about marijuana legalization. We're about to come up on the 5-year anniversary of Initiative 71 here in DC, yet I don't see any dispensaries. If that's what legalization is supposed to look like, why don't we have that? Well, the answer is because it only took one rich, land-owning, Anglo-Saxon white man to prevent DC from doing that, and he doesn't even live here. So, that's what has been happening in the United States since its inception. Rich, land-owning white men saying whether or not something is or is not allowed. So to me, that's not legalization, and it never will be. In terms of decriminalization, I'm obviously a huge fan of decriminalizing any behavior that's not having a detrimental impact on others and or on society. And typically drug use doesn't. Obviously, I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but the most dangerous thing about drug use is drug prohibition, right? I know I see our dance safe friends over there like nodding their heads. I mean, this is what they do with their time. I'm hoping here in the coming months to, in the city that I'm on the council, like, I'm gonna be trying to decriminalize drug possession for everything. And I'm hoping that being in a city that borders DC, that we'll be able to get some national attention for that. I think it's neat what Oakland has done. I think it's really neat what Denver's been able to do, but like, I don't need to keep going. I'm just gonna ... You guys get what the limitations are. For decrim though, the other thing that I wanna say, and this is again, I think pretty obvious to people inside this room, we should decriminalize drug possession. We should decriminalize, in my opinion, propagation and even distribution or sharing of drugs. But under decriminalization, you still have an illicit marketplace, which is one of the things that makes a lot of substances the most dangerous. I've experimented with a lot of different substances. The hardest drug I've ever done is alcohol, and that's very readily available. It's commercialized. Not only that, it's part of the social fabric of our society. It's seen as a rite of passage that you're not only that you're supposed to use it, but you're supposed to use it before it becomes legal for you to do so. So it should be very clear to us that putting age restrictions and putting location restrictions and putting all these types of restrictions on a legal substance like alcohol, if it can work for that, then it can work for any other substance too. But I think we need to get rid of the rule. Raise your hand if you waited till you were 21 to drink alcohol. So obviously that, I think we have one hand up in the room, which is one of my constituents, by the way. Hey, so obviously that's not working, right? I hope that was helpful.
You just sparked something for me around youth. Youth are definitely scapegoated when it comes to like drug policy reform. And the idea that criminalization still works is continued when it comes to youth for some reason, because people are just so scared about children and young people using drugs when we know criminalization doesn't get drugs out of the hands of kids. So again, in efforts around decriminalizing drugs, legalizing drugs, we have to decriminalize drug use for under 21-year-olds. Whether or not legal access is going to be available for them, but at least decriminalize possession and use for them so they're not continued to be like struggling with criminalization and the impacts of that. Because I mean, in DC, the rates of black youth being arrested for marijuana are also skyrocketing post Initiative 71, despite the intense decrease of arrests in general. Black youth are definitely, especially black youth that are men, boys, are definitely over disproportionately represented when it comes to marijuana arrests right now in DC.
So I have mixed feelings about these psychedelic-specific initiatives that are popping up everywhere all of a sudden. It seems like there's going to be a lot more probably in the next few years. On the one hand, it's really good to see that people in the psychedelic spaces are looking beyond medicalization to address criminalization. But then at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily strategic to separate out psychedelics from drug decriminalization more broadly. At the Drug Policy Alliance, they've been in the process for a number of years of starting to build out plans to run initiatives, and are planning to do one in Oregon probably in 2020 on drug decriminalization. But if you look at like the public support of like the general public for different drug policies, drug decriminalization broadly is actually quite high. It's around 50% nationally. In some states, it's higher than that. And actually, when you poll the general public about psychedelics decriminalization, it's quite similar to that. So you don't get a lot of advantage by separating out psychedelics. The public are not psychedelics exceptionalists, for better or worse. And so I think in some ways these psychedelic-specific initiatives aren't ambitious enough. There's already broad political support for drug decriminalization. A lot of countries in Europe have policies that are very close to drug decriminalization. Czech Republic, in addition, it's not just Portugal, also the Czech Republic. Spain has a pretty good system. But then, so at the same time, recognizing that people are going to be doing these psychedelic specific initiatives. I think we can learn a lot from marijuana legalization in looking at how to get ideas for how to structure it in a way that repairs the harms of prohibition. That's the whole battle with marijuana legalization now, is not whether it's going to happen, but can we get all these provisions in it to repair the harms of prohibition as well, which is a harder fight than just commercializing it and walking away. And so, yeah, these initiatives can, put in measures that are like non-commercial models. We assume that psychedelics legalization means, rampant capitalism, and that's definitely a a threat to happen. But there are non-commercial models from other parts of the world that we can look at to some degree. Like in Spain, they have cooperative social clubs for cannabis where there's not a commercial corporate system, but people can join little membership cooperatives in their neighborhood where they grow the plants there, and you pay like a membership fee of like $100 a year, a month, or I don't know how much. And then you have legal access to the cannabis, and then drugs are decriminalized there as well. So similar models could be theoretically implemented for psychedelics.
Can I say something about Denver real quick?
Yeah.
How many people were getting arrested for mushrooms in Denver anyway? Like 7? You know what I mean? Like how many people per year? It probably wasn't that many. So like in terms of the impact on who or who isn't being arrested, I'm not sure that it was that significant. I understand that decriminalization may be a necessary component for access, right? And I actually interviewed the campaign director for that campaign on my podcast, and we talked about this very subject. But Denver is a very white city. And who thinks our corporate overlords would have allowed Baltimore to be the first city to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms? I don't, personally.
Just wanting to add on like the political reach of drug decrim. Like we're seeing 2020 candidates talking about drug decrim. Mayor Buttigieg just included all drug decriminalization in his mental health and addiction plan, and like it's a conversation that's now further being had in a way that feels like, in the same way that marijuana took a while to have people starting to support it, people starting to recognize that the sky won't fall, people starting to actually look at the evidence behind it and starting to, try to imagine a different world. So it's not like drug decrim is so far-fetched that this is the only option, like the piecemeal, each substance by substance. So I really encourage folks to think broadly about the war on drugs when it comes to, finally getting substances to be liberalized. But in addition, I think marijuana is now, the fights and the efforts in marijuana reform can really lay the ground for really understanding what is most important when we're ending prohibition and starting off with that and censoring it. Because right now in the marijuana space, it's consistent fights between advocates and people in the industry, consistent fights against people across the aisle in terms of what actually is the priority here when we're talking about ending prohibition. So in the psychedelic space, there really needs to be an understanding of what actually are we doing and why and who are we doing it for and what's the impact of what we're doing and what really is the goal here. What does reparative justice look like when it comes to ending prohibition for psychedelics? What does it look like for broader, outside of just drug use itself? What does it look like for allowing communities of color to heal and actually have access to medicine that could provide that healing? What does it look like for access for communities of color in general when we end prohibition for psychedelics? Are people of color going to have easy access to psychedelics? Because I know, when it comes to studies and the steps that we've already taken around psychedelics, people of color oftentimes are already left out. And we haven't even gotten that close to talking about legalizing psychedelics yet. So what is it going to look like when we're there? So marijuana is giving us that space now to really think about what that looks like.
Yes. So I love all those questions you just asked, so I'm going to turn it back to you guys. How do you envision the regulation of psychedelics and how you envision access for that. So, Jag, you mentioned the model, the co-op model in Spain. Are there other models of regulation and access that you guys think that we could possibly use for psychedelics? And, because we're in such in limbo place with psychedelics right now in terms of our policy, I'm up for discussing all the different possibilities. So don't feel like you have to have just one correct answer. But I'd love to hear from you guys of like how you envision legal access, how you envision regulation, and how you envision that specifically for folks of color.
I'll start. I too got my start with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, about 7 years ago. I was Dr. Sue Sisley's study assistant on the first ever federally approved medical cannabis for treating veterans with PTSD study. Unfortunately, that study was killed by some politicians in Arizona, but was later funded after I was already long gone. But the reason I bring that up is because MAPS has done extraordinary work using MDMA to treat veterans with PTSD. And I think that's great, but you shouldn't have to be in the military to have access to that. You shouldn't have to be reliving flashbacks of IED explosions and reliving seeing your comrades murdered on the battlefield to have access to this healing medicine. It should be ready, available to everyone. So I'm very wary of the idea that you need to have experienced certain things to be allowed to use these substances, and that's just a trend that I wanted to plant that flag there where everyone can see it, because it's something that tells me that we're leading in the wrong direction. But giving like the 30,000 foot view, the problem that we have here, I think, actually goes back at least several thousand years, because in the context of modern human history, so post-agriculture, it's a new development in the ancient Near East, and for sure in the West, that there would be a distinction between a spiritual advisor and a doctor and a psychologist. Throughout most of human history, that was the same profession. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing that we've specialized in those areas and that people pursue one or another, but I think that returning to a multidisciplinary approach to those types of professions would be helpful, because one of the reasons we've separated that profession into three separate things is because the idea that there's a distinction between self and other is rooted in Western culture as well. It's rooted in the traditions of the ancient Near East again, right? And so it's the genesis of the idea of believing that you as an individual being are separate from the rest of the universe. Well, why does that matter? Because being separate from the universe and needing to conquer nature was a really convenient story white people could tell themselves while they were colonizing the rest of the world. And so until we fix that, a lot of these conversations we're having might not matter, because we have to end this mindset of being separate from the rest of the universe. I know that's like a really out there thing, like for the question that you're asking, but it shouldn't have to take doing 2 tabs of acid at a music festival to realize that your ego is an illusion and that you are not separate from the rest of the universe. It's something that we should be teaching and something that we should be talking about regularly, and I think that we have to fix that.
I just wanted to piggyback on the PTSD portion of what you were talking about, because I really, really have strong feelings about this, because veterans are not the only people who have PTSD. People develop PTSD from all types of violence, watching friends and family members die from gun violence, sexual violence, abuse, poverty. There's, generational trauma. People are struggling with trauma all the time, and they didn't have to go to the military to get it. So again, the medicalization of psychedelics and it being centered really in veterans is so limiting. And then the medicalization of it also makes it so we can't have the bigger conversation about the fact that people use drugs for recreation too. And we should have psychedelic access for people outside of just traumatic experiences. So people should be able to use, adults should be able to use psychedelics regardless of whether or not they have extreme levels of trauma. But really expanding how we imagine what trauma looks like. And this is intentional. It's not like people don't know that other people experience trauma, but veterans are seemingly more, politically viable and politically more appreciated across the aisle. Veterans are often used as a token. And not all veterans, because Black veterans also don't get that same kind of uplifting when it comes to medicalization of psychedelics. So it's really just having to unpack all of this now as we're like on the front end of, monumental like history happening with psychedelics being explored as a substance that's worth decriminalizing, legalizing. But we really need to do it in a comprehensive way, and in a way that includes all of us intentionally.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's counterintuitive, but to really fix the whole issue of like psychedelic regulation, we need to not just focus on psychedelics. I think ultimately, getting involved with working closely with people who are doing healthcare reform, people who are doing broader criminal justice reform in your community, people who are providing health and harm reduction services and advocating for those tools, working with insurgent candidates, and people trying to get into political office who have a broader vision around how to integrate psychedelics into society is ultimately going to be necessary. We get so put into these kind of like single issue boxes, and I think that was something working at DPA that was a tension in the organization for me and for others, which is that we're a drug policy organization. That was our mission, but we also wanted to work a lot with immigration reform groups and racial justice groups, but then we couldn't take a position on their issues. We couldn't come out in favor of comprehensive immigration reform or make, or broader reforms around policing and violence. And that in some ways like limited our effectiveness in some ways. So, yeah.
Would MAPS be getting millions of dollars to buy MDMA if Rick Doblin was Black? I know Rick. Rick is a friend of mine. Like I said, I used to intern at MAPS. I've talked to him while I had a handful of MDMA in my palm, which he didn't know. But I don't think that MAPS would be MAPS if Rick Doblin wasn't Black. And I've talked to him about what I'm about to say to you. I saw him at the Reform Conference. Which one was in Atlanta, 2017?
Yes.
2017, where there was a panel where they were talking about the amazing progress they've made with the MDMA trials for treating PTSD. And I think the numbers that I remember is something like 90% of the study participants were still in remission of their symptoms after 12 months. But I left the room for another reason, but it looks dramatic because people thought I was leaving the room because what he said. Because I heard him wonder aloud why there weren't more people of color participating in the PTSD trials. And I just wanted to stand up and he was like, well, where are all the Black veterans? And I just wanted to stand up and be like, why don't you hire one and ask them? Maybe they can tell you what their perspective is, so that it's not a panel full of mostly white people wondering aloud why they just can't figure out why there aren't any people of color in these studies. What's the race of the doctors? How much does that matter? So, I mean, these are all, again, I love MAPS. I like a lot of the people that work for MAPS. I know a lot of them. They're doing amazing work. It's invaluable, and I want them to continue. But again, trying to do restorative justice within a framework that is fundamentally unjust, I just don't think that's going to work. And I don't think, and to the extent that it does, I don't think that it's going to reach its maximum potential. We have to dismantle racial hierarchy in order to move forward with this stuff. We just have to, full stop.
Thank you. I want to know what kind of cultural issues should be taken into account for creating policy on psychedelics. Scott, you just mentioned the racial hierarchy. Obviously, we have to dismantle that, which will take a long time. But are there other things that we should be considering in terms of cultural issues for psychedelics? I know with California, Prop 64, DPA did a lot of work around making sure that folks who were harmed by or had a record, had their marijuana records expunged, and the licensing programs still in the works, but those are some things that we've done to repair the harms of the war on drugs. But are there other cultural issues, reparative justice related things that we should take into account for psychedelic policy?
I suppose on some level it's not safe for anyone to be selling psychedelics, but it's definitely not safe for Black and brown people to do it. So like, does that kind of answer your question? To me, access is not just about whether or not something is criminalized. It's about who has access to providing it. Psychedelics to me is also like a social interaction, a social transaction almost. I think probably most of us who have experimented with psychedelics, we were given it by a friend or a loved one who probably took it with us, or nurtured us through that process. And it's just, white people are allowed to do stuff like that more frequently than others. I hope that's helpful. I'm not really sure what I'm gonna let Queen talk or Jag talk, because I find when I'm on panels with you, like every time you say something, it makes all my neurons vibrate, and then I'm like, now I remember what I was gonna say. So.
For me, this question brings up indigenous folks and where individual psychedelics actually come from, and whether or not indigenous folks actually will have access to drugs that came from their culture and from their lands. I think about, the overuse of certain psychedelics that now endanger the actual substance that is native to specific people who often are never named when folks are talking about psychedelic experiences. For me, again, like the access for people who have experienced trauma, whether or not they have a formal diagnosis of PTSD, because we know Black and brown people are overdiagnosed and then also underdiagnosed for things, including trauma, and we know that trauma in Black and brown folks is never recognized. So how do we ensure that when we finally have wide access to psychedelics, that people who experience trauma, and typically disproportionately people who experience trauma are folks who are the most marginalized, how do we make sure that they have access to these plants, to these substances? And again, like they're being provided these substances by someone who looks like them, and the whole experience isn't traumatic. I mean, the healthcare system is pretty traumatic. And I mean, just like as a queer Black woman, like just in my own personal experiences, like going to the doctor often is like a shitty situation because of a whole bunch of different barriers. But when we think about like having access to this medicine, like what does that look like for people of color? What does it look like for people with trauma that are not veterans? I think those kind of conversations need to be a part of what ending prohibition for those substances look like. Not just, clean, oh, it's off the controlled substance list. Go Honda.
We're gonna do questions later.
Like I said, every time Queen talks, it makes my neurons fire. And I remembered something that I wanted to share today, which ties exactly into what you were saying. I don't remember where I heard this, but it was pretty recently. A plurality of doctors in the United States in 2019, when asked, said that they said that they believe that Black people have thicker skin, literally, and also that Black people have a higher pain tolerance than whites.
That shit is in medical school books.
Right? So like that, in 2019, that is pervasive among the medical community, which to me was sadly unsurprising, but shocking. So I know that it's not a psychedelic, but if you're injured or you're in an accident and you go to the emergency room, you go to the hospital, you're much less likely to be given opioids if you are a Black or brown person. In certain parts of the United States, I actually believe, including in Washington, D.C., the maternal fatality rate for Black women is equal of that in many third world countries. But when we talk about, one thing, I'm jumping around a little bit, I'm sorry, Yves, but another thing that occurs to me, and I did a podcast recording at the most recent SSDP conference in Chicago, and one of the students, 18-year-old young Black woman, was like, was talking about the fact that it's hard to unpack because it's a little bit emotional. Because I was embarrassed to think, man, I've been on this earth for 37 years. I consider myself someone who's entrenched in social justice and drug policy reform. But it never occurred to me that often when talking about the indigenous roots of many psychedelic substances, we think about like Central America, but like I'm pretty sure there are psychedelic and plant-based medicines in Africa and in the Far East and in Mesopotamia. I mean, those civilizations have been there for 5,000 years. And we don't even talk about those ones. And so it got me thinking about if you sat down and wrote down different drugs that are legal or prohibited, and you think about where they were invented, well, where does beer come from? That's the only drug I can think of that was invented in Europe. It's pervasive everywhere. But that's not true of cannabis. It's not true of poppies. It's not true of a lot of plant-based medicines. And I know I keep using the quotes, but it's just because some of these labels just don't work for me. And part of how we fix some of these issues that the four of us are bringing up is coming up with better nomenclature. And so I'm going to continue using quotes for the things that I think don't work.
Yes. Yes.
Drug is a vacuous word, like sports. Tennis and boxing and baseball are all sports, but they have very little to do with one another. Similarly, drugs is almost a meaningless word at this point. I mean, I've got coffee right here, like.
Yeah, and how does a substance become a drug? How does a substance become stigmatized? I think those are all really good questions to think through in our head. You know, how even us ourselves as folks who are psychedelics enthusiasts, you know, we still tend to have a tendency to stigmatize other drug users, right? Like, for me, myself, I have in my family folks who struggle with alcoholism. So sometimes I have to watch myself and say, like, whoa, like, let me not look down on people who like to drink as much. And we also have to do that same for ourselves, because these drugs, quote unquote, they all come from something, and one's not better than the other.
Also, people are just trying to find a release. Living in this world is really difficult, and it's more difficult for a lot of different people. And like, it's the same, I have the same sentiments when I think about like the smoking ban in public housing, like banning tobacco smoking for people who live in public housing. It's fucked up. Like, how can you tell somebody who likes to smoke cigarettes that if you want to continue living here, you have to stop or face eviction? Like, having someone choose something that is a stress reliever for them, whether or not you agree with it, it's not hurting anyone. How do you tell someone that they have to choose between that substance and give them no resources to help them either find another avenue or find a way to like stop using, and then just make it so that their housing is now insecure if they're a cigarette smoker? It's just not, it's not fair, and it's understandable to evaluate the public health impacts and the actual, you know, the impacts of people's bodies. Those are real things. There are risks when it comes to using drugs. It's not like we're pretending that drug use is risk-free, but the point is to just reduce the harms of drug use and people's choices and giving people the ability to make those choices for themselves.
We can't destigmatize any of these substances until we're willing to be brave enough to talk about them in an open way. So I'm an elected official. I've smoked crack twice, and I liked it. It was fun. It was enjoyable. I didn't become addicted, and I found it to be very useful in the two situations that I decided to use it. And like, I think we should be allowed to be honest about that. I think it's weird that one of my political counterparts could be an alcoholic, and people could know about that, and it wouldn't affect their political career at all. So like, I got nothing to lose. I only get paid $7,000 a year to be on city council anyway, so it's on camera. I've smoked crack before. I hope people are okay with that. You know, we've had two presidents who've used cocaine, and that was okay,
shit.
right?
Yep.
So.
Yep, they're the same thing. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate your candor.
We gotta be authentic and honest, you know.
For real, because it's particularly with crack. There's been a very particular racialized stigma attached to that, And Queen, you brought up the crack epidemic that primarily affected black and brown folks in our neighborhoods. And, you know, folks turned a blind eye to it when people were dying, our neighborhoods were being destroyed. So I really appreciate you owning that, Scott, and being open about that.
Keeping it 100. I mean, I even equivocated because I was like, I've smoked crack twice. I didn't need to say it twice. For all you know, I smoked crack this morning, and like, I still think that would have been okay. It would have been fine.
Yeah, I'll just emphasize how important it is not to consciously or unconsciously bifurcate drugs in our mind into good and bad categories. It's something that really, I was an anthropology major in college and did a lot of cross-cultural studies of altered states of consciousness, and that's a pretty universal feature. Well, pretty much almost every part of the world had some form of psychedelic that was integrated into their social order. It's pretty universal for people to bifurcate drugs in that way and substances, and to demonize people who don't use what their group, their preferred drug. And, you know, speaking of a drug like crack cocaine, you know, Carl Hart, who is brilliant, always makes the point that, you know, 80 to 90% of people who try what we consider the worst drugs, heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine, the vast majority of them do not develop a problem and do not develop an addiction. That's what we end up seeing. The people who have problems are the ones who are the most visible, and that's largely a result of prohibition. But I think it's also important to emphasize that, you know, looking historically at cultures that have integrated psychedelics into their society, it's a mixed bag in some ways too, because then you're upholding the social order. And what if they're being used to uphold the social order? What if there are problems with the social order, and you know, you're living in a violent and patriarchal society? You know, an example I give sometimes to try to show that psychedelics aren't inherently, you know, don't have inherent qualities the way we think, is that people in Northern Europe, like the Vikings, would use Amanita muscaria mushrooms as a tool to get all psyched up to go out and raid villages and kill people and rape people. So, you know, my anthropology professor in college asked me one time, she was like, well, you know, what do you think would happen if, like, the military started integrating psychedelic therapy into their boot camp? You know, it would probably just make people, you know, more bought into the system and more effective at killing other people, potentially. So we have to be careful not to assign inherent qualities to substances. So
we're gonna have questions at the end.
Good question.
Yeah, but thank you. So next, moving on, I wanted to talk about research. I know recently AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, got some attention for proposing expanding drug research, particularly with psychedelics. So can you speak to the importance of expanding psychedelic research and, you know, like scientific medical research around psychedelics and all drugs in general too?
Can I give a plug for Queen really quick?
Sure, yes.
Also, because I know that she's humble and is not gonna like take a bunch of credit, like Queen is like the person that's up on Capitol Hill, that's talking to the AOCs of the world, doing the work at Congress, like talking to them about the need to end drug prohibition. And so I just wanna, you know, for people, it's not just you alone, but for people like Queen, there are real people behind the scenes that are never gonna ask for or receive any credit once we dismantle the drug war. And this strong, beautiful black woman sitting next to me is one of them. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I know that if it was me doing your job instead of you, I would have been like, oh my God, I'm at ALC. It would have been all over my Twitter, Instagram, all that. And like, I would have made it about me. And so I'm just really glad that you're there doing the work that you're doing. So thank you.
it's wild because sometimes research feels like a thing that always ends up in a conclusion that water's wet. When it's like research sometimes feels really annoying when it's like it's usually used politically and it's meant really for white people because they don't necessarily listen to experiences and like need it to be in a specific format. So research and reports and academic language is really, really important when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to better understanding the effects and impacts of drugs. And the way criminalization has operated is that they schedule drugs and then make them undesirables and they're not studyable and like they add all these enhanced barriers to research and complicate like really the general academic understanding of drugs, at least from the validated understanding of the government, because there are other, alternative forms of research that we know about certain drugs. So research and ending prohibition and removing drugs from the controlled substance list really open up a whole plethora of understanding when it comes to drugs. We can finally fully, research and study drugs in a way that'll make it easier for us to figure out what access should look like, what regulation models should look like, what are the medical and public health impacts of the drugs themselves, not just the drug use of like people's drug use, but really just the interaction of drugs in our culture and socially and economics, and just all of the ways that drug use impacts people on an individual and a community level. So research is really, really important. And really until there's research, we won't have like widespread enhanced like advocacy, like reform movements. And that's why like prohibition is like a cyclical, like never-ending problem where they need research to validate that we can finally end prohibition, but you can't do research because it's a prohibited substance. So it's just this weird cycle. Basically, we need research, and decriminalizing on the federal level will allow us to finally do that in a robust way.
Yeah, I'd say despite the fact that there's a so-called psychedelic research renaissance taking place now, the scope of the research is still really, really limited because it's all just focused on trying to get FDA approval, and that's what the money is for. And so there's a whole range of other avenues that aren't being explored. For example, one thing that has bothered me for years is we actually don't really know the impact of psychedelic criminalization because there's not data on arrests. Or it's very, very tedious to go through local data just to find it for one particular jurisdiction because the way it gets aggregated, they don't separate it by drugs. It's just like marijuana, heroin, and cocaine in one category, and then meth and everything else. So I would love to see people doing, even like ethnographic research, of like interviewing people who have been arrested and looking at like where are people actually getting arrested for psychedelics. I'll give a shout out to my former colleague who works at the Ifetayo Queen, Stephanie Jones, who has started something called the Safer Partying Program, where they work with events and festivals and nightlife venues, the kinds of places where people are likely to use psychedelics in public and then end up interacting with law enforcement, even just driving back from the festival afterwards. You always read a lot of police reports with this of people getting, in rural areas getting pulled over coming out of festivals. So it'd be interesting to look into deeper, like what are the harms of psychedelic criminalization, so then we can have a better idea how to focus on them. And I'd be curious, I think there's an assumption too that, psychedelics are, predominantly used by white people, which the data does bear out, but I would be curious to see what the disparities are, especially if the arrests are taking place in settings, in places where people gather for nightlife or festival settings, like what kind of festivals are they arresting people at, and what are the demographics, and yeah, there's a lot, but there's so many different avenues that we could talk about for research.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, rates of use don't even matter. I mean, we know like Black and white people could use drugs at the same rates, which we know with marijuana for sure, and disproportionately Black and brown people like dominate arrests and incarceration. So even understanding if the data matches up that white folks predominantly in the US are using psychedelics, it would be a huge surprise if, and it's not the case that white people are, at least in terms of ratio, in terms of population-wise, like black folks are